Curt Vendel is sadly no longer with us, having passed away way before his time at the age of 53 back in September 2020. I remember this news hitting pretty hard during what was already a difficult time for a lot of people. He was a well-known and loved figure in the Atari community, and I had some good chats with him myself on Facebook Messenger early on in my collecting days. There was nothing he loved more than sharing his knowledge and expertise on all things Atari, so very much a kindred spirit. Curt, an engineer from New York, was a veteran of the scene, originally running Staten Island Atari Users Group in the early 80s and later on, its spin-off BBS in the pre-internet days. He was a prolific collector and documenter of Atari history, picking up a lot of abandoned paperwork, data files and even one-off prototypes over his lifetime, particularly when Atari went bust in the mid-90s. In fact, by the early 2000s he owned more historical Atari technical documentation than Atari itself, by that point owned by French game publisher Infogrames, and so they brought him on board to work as a technical consultant for various retro TV game type devices like this one, made by Jakks Pacific, which I've actually had from new and dates to 2002. This all culminated in the original Flashback consoles. Over 15 years before the NES Classic, PlayStation Classic and Genesis Mini, Curt's company Legacy Engineering designed and built what was essentially the first plug-and-play mini console, in this case based on the Atari 7800. This first iteration from 2004 has 20 built-in games, and was reportedly developed in 10 weeks, with Curt doing the bulk of the electrical engineering and porting work himself. By his own admission, he wasn't happy with the situation, as he'd had to use off-the-shelf components designed for knock-off NES-on-a-chip type consoles. So, once it hit store shelves, he immediately started on the Flashback 2, which was redesigned from the ground up using the original schematics of the Atari 2600. Fortunately, he personally owned the originals. In fact, his Flashback 2 was so close to the original design that it could even be modded with a cartridge slot to play original cartridges. But the story of those is something I'm going to cover in a future video because it's a pretty fascinating tale in its own right. In this one, I want to talk about Curt's website, originally launched in 1997 as AtariHistory.com, later moving to its permanent home at AtariMuseum.com. The trouble is, the domain registration expired a year after he passed in 2021, and the site's files were hosted on his home server. He made no records of any passwords, and his family and associates haven't been able to gain access, and so that was it. A lifetime's worth of online preservation and documentation work gone. Thankfully, it was at least partially preserved by the Internet Archive's Wayback Machine. Now, please don't get me wrong, the Internet Archive does incredible work, and I'm so glad that it exists. But if you've ever tried to browse a website on the Wayback Machine, you'll know that it's slow and usually riddled with broken images and missing files, which is an unfortunate side effect of their crawling process. So I took it upon myself to reconstruct the Atari Museum as it stood in 2021, using the Wayback Machine downloader and some files that hadn't been archived from a much older mirror of the site's predecessor, AtariHistory.com, hosted at pigwa.net. It's a bit of an ongoing project, and I've put it all in a GitHub repo, as well as making the site itself available online with the blessing of Carl Morris, who was Curt's partner in the Atari Historical Society and actually ran his own site called Atari Explorer, which we're also in the process of trying to rebuild and make available once more. Incidentally, Carl now writes and publishes books on Atari history under the brand Zafin Books. And no, he hasn't sponsored this video or anything, he's just been really friendly and helpful, and I happen to own all of his books, and they're a real labour of love with a lot of first-hand information that you won't find anywhere else. So I'll link to those, as well as everything else mentioned in this video, in the usual place, if this piques your interest in obscure Atari history. Curt spent over 20 years putting all of this stuff online to be seen and to educate people, so I think that the least I could do is to show you some of the cool stuff I found picking through every single page of his website. And oh yes, there's some cool stuff, including a holographic game system, a working video phone from the 1970s, a pet robot, and even mind control. But first, let's start with something a bit more familiar. This is the Atari CX2000 prototype, also known as the CX2500 or the VAL, after the co-designer Greg Squire's wife. Atari's iconic video computer system, or 2600 console, had been out for 5 years at this point, and Atari wanted to give it a fresh redesign for the 1980s. So, a company called Henry Dreyfuss Associates were brought on board to commission a study into so-called human factors, basically ergonomics and the like. and the dimensions of the console and design of the integrated joysticks were incorporated into these 1982 prototypes as a result of their feedback, with a classic brown version being built by Atari's New York lab, and the slightly later and more complete blue version being built in their home of Sunnyvale, California. They feature a cartridge slot in the rear this time, not in the top like the older 2600, alongside the more familiar joystick and power and RF connectors. There was a redesigned motherboard to fit into the new case, and unlike the earlier versions that use metal dome contacts, the joysticks use Mylar Flex PCBs similar to the later 5200, so I imagine they probably didn't work very well. Also in Curt's collection are some schematics for a joystickless version dating to later on in '82, which of course is much more similar to the 2600 Junior, which would eventually be released in 1986 under Atari's new owner Jack Tramiel, although the Junior shares very little in common with this prototype and was marketed as a low-cost option alongside Atari's current consoles of the time, the XEGS and the 7800. So, if you're one of my OGs and have been watching this channel since the very beginning, you'll no doubt remember this. Atari's Touch Me handheld game from 1978, from the short-lived Electronic Games division, which had its very own headquarters on Fifth Avenue in New York. It's basically a Simon-type game where you have to memorise the patterns and press the buttons in the correct order. Pretty impressive for a low-cost thing that you could slip into your pocket in 1978. Now, thanks to the Atari Museum, we discover that Atari actually had more grand ambitions for its handheld gaming division, with this marketing mock-up for an officially licensed Space Invaders game and a version of their very own Super Breakout. Unfortunately, sales of Touch Me were sluggish, so Atari decided to pull the plug on the whole division. The other two games were slated for release in 1980, and Atari's Linda Whitten even produced, sadly non-functional mock-ups, featuring a spinner or paddle and a single button for control. It's a real shame these never saw the light of day, and it seems that no working prototypes of either game were ever produced. But Atari's Holoptics lab, as in holograms, did manage to get their own handheld all the way to the finish line the following year in 1981. Now, Atari at the time was absolutely convinced that holography, as in holograms, was going to be the future of gaming and invested heavily in the technology. The end result was the Cosmos, developed under Allan Alcorn, who was perhaps more famously known as the designer of Pong, and Atari even developed 8 different games for it, produced retail packaging, sales flyers and other marketing material, and commissioned a pilot run of 250 units. Now, the Cosmos wasn't perhaps quite as exciting as it seemed, as the display itself wasn't actually holographic, so to speak. It used a grid of 40 LEDs as the display with a holographic overlay. In fact, the overlays actually went into production and do come up for sale on eBay from private collectors from time to time, although I'm not sure what this seller was smoking when they came up with that price. Atari was also working on a more sophisticated tabletop version called the Spector, which used the same grid of LEDs and a rotating hologram to give a more convincing 3D effect. And it seems, based on the images from the Atari Museum, that they were at least at the prototype stage with that model. In the end, despite taking over 8,000 pre-orders at 1981's New York Toy Fair, Atari's then CEO Ray Kassar pulled the plug on the project, instead wanting to focus on sales of their VCS or 2600 console. It's not known how many Cosmos units survived, but Curt at least had one working console in his possession and posted this video of it in action on the museum website, as well as showing it at some Atari meetups. The technology developed for this game ended up in a very obscure tabletop called the Endzs Adventure Vision, which used an even more migraine-inducing system of rotating mirrors in combination with the LEDs, and that may have even gone on to inspire Nintendo's Virtual Boy, but I think that's way off topic for this video. So, still well and truly in the sci-fi camp, let's move on from holograms to mind control. Oh yes. Well, not quite. You see, in 1980, Atari partnered with Hong Kong-based electronics manufacturer Wong's Electronics to produce low-cost 2600 consoles. The company was better known as a keyboard manufacturer, but Atari engineers Jim Scudder and Bill Lapham worked closely with them to produce a whole new concept in game control devices. Thus, the MindLink was born. Now, I mentioned a moment ago that this wasn't really mind control, and it wasn't. It was basically a headband that measured electrical impulses in the wearer's forehead muscles. A couple of games were known to be adapted to work with it. Pong, of course, and a version of Breakout, which had been rebranded as Bionic Breakthrough. And these games were chosen due to the limitations of the device itself, and the fact that they only required the player to move in one dimension, left and right or up and down. After a few years of secretive development and fine-tuning, Atari had sunk millions of dollars into prototyping and getting manufacturing contracts in place for the electronics and even the plastics, and started marketing the device with a big announcement in 1984. The day after announcing MindLink on US national TV, Atari was approached by the organisers of the Special Olympics, who were interested in using it as an assistive technology for their athletes, and proposals were made internally for extra sensors that could attach to the arms and legs for a fully immersive experience. So, what became of this amazing technology? Well, a month after the announcement, most of Atari was sold by its then owners, Warner Communications, to Jack Tramiel's Tramiel Technologies Limited, who saw it as nothing more than a toy and cancelled the entire thing. A few units did survive. Curt owned at least one complete setup and demoed it at the 2003 Austin Gaming Expo, but that was that. There's a reason Tramiel had a reputation for being ruthless. But here's one thing that Warner didn't sell to the Tramiels, instead deciding to sell it to a subsidiary of the Japanese electronics giant Mitsubishi, Atari's highly secretive phone division, known throughout most of its life as Project Falcon, but unveiled to the world at CES 1983 under the much more appropriate name ATARITEL. Of particular interest was video phone technology, and the ATARITEL page on Atari Museum goes into the history of this technology in really fascinating detail. And this article formed the basis of a chapter in Curt's book, Business is Fun, which I still think is one of the best books I've ever read on what life was like inside Atari Inc. in those early days, and it's another one I can highly recommend if you're interested in this kind of stuff. Anyway, this research culminated in a working video phone known as Phoney, which was developed at Atari's Grass Valley, California engineering lab under its elite development team Cyan Engineering way back in 1976. The system relied on the fact that normal phone conversations would have pauses in them, and it was these moments of silence when the video data would be sent across the line, in the form of a series of monochrome 16x16 resolution still images. Obviously, the more awkward silences, the more frequently the image would update. There's even a funny story about Atari founder Nolan Bushnell visiting for a demo and using it as an opportunity to moon his engineers in the next office, which sounds very much in character for him. Unfortunately, this original prototype was destroyed when Atari engineer Ron Milner, more on him in a second, decided to steal the power supply for another project and accidentally sent 110 volts through its 5-volt rail, frying the electronics. This incident was added to an ever-expanding list of disasters for the Cyan Engineering team, which apparently was so frequent that there was a dedicated file at Atari's HQ for documenting them. ATARITEL was revived in 1981 and went on to work with Porsche Design to produce some really sleek and futuristic looking handsets, with the focus being on speakerphones for corporate use. In fact, one of their designs, known as the Eagle, even ended up on display in the legendary Museum of Modern Art in New York. Also in Curt's collection is a prototype of a really innovative phone/home intercom system known as the Telectra, which was apparently of particular interest to Atari's owners, Warner Communications, who funded the project very generously. As you can see from this TV ad featuring MASH's Alan Alda, the Telectra allowed a house's power lines to be used to create a network of handsets that could transfer calls between them and act as an intercom.
This one's called the Telectra, and it does things all the other smartphones do, stores numbers, redials, works as a speakerphone, but it also does something none of those other phones are smart enough to do. It can turn this ordinary AC wall outlet and every other outlet in your home into a telephone jack. Without any extra wiring, without any extra expense, with no more fuss than I'm going to show you right now.
As alluded to earlier, the ATARITEL division was sold to Mitsubishi in 1983, who went on to use Atari's technology to develop the Lumaphone, a commercially available video phone released in 1986. So, I said I'd talk a bit more about Ron Milner, you know, the guy who blew up the priceless one-off prototype video phone. He's perhaps most famously known for co-creating the original VCS console prototype alongside Steve Meyer, again as part of Atari's elite Cyan Engineering team based in Grass Valley. The story goes that on one of Atari boss Nolan Bushnell's legendary visits, he challenged Ron to design and build a robot that could, and I quote, "bring me a beer." Thus, the Kermit project was born. Kermit was built around a single-board kit computer from MOS Technology called the KIM-1, which featured the popular 6502 CPU. He moved in a similar way to a modern Roomba, with 2 wheels driven by independent DC motors and a caster underneath, and featured a sophisticated suite of sensors, including sonar rangefinders, microphones, infrared, and a bump sensor made out of burglar alarm tape. All of this interfaced with the Kim 1 using 3 custom cards developed in-house by Ron and his colleagues at Cyan. The top dome, built inside a salad bowl from a local department store, could rotate independently so Kermit could look around, and underneath his hair is a switch that allowed him to be petted, responding with R2-D2-like cheerful beeps from his internal speaker, kind of like a 1970s Furby. He even had his own official Atari ID badge. Later on, Kermit was used as a platform to develop a robot navigation system using an off-the-shelf barcode scanner. Sadly, he met his demise while under the care of Atari arcade engineer Owen Rubin, who still owns Kermit to this day, who unfortunately left him unsupervised in Atari's Sunnyvale offices, where he fell down the stairs. So, those are some of my absolute favourite things that I found while exploring Curt Vendel's Atari Museum. If you're interested in this weird and wonderful Atari history, the link to the museum and the books I've mentioned are in the description. If you'd like me to do another one of these, digging out some more cool stuff, do let me know down in the comments, and be sure to subscribe so you don't miss any future updates. This one has been a load of fun to put together, and there's a lot more where these came from. Finally, I just want to say thanks to my supporters, whose names you can see on screen as I speak. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll hopefully see you next time.